debate. The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It is always a privilege and a pleasure to rise in this place. And on this particular issue, I rose last in early October to speak to the House about the Liberals' failure to turn over documents on the Green Slush Fund as requested by the House of Commons, duly elected and agreed to by the Speaker. So 2 months later, it's pretty obvious that the government is more concerned about what damage might emerge from handing over these documents and the consequences that may follow, instead of moving ahead with their own agenda. As flawed as that agenda may be, they are choosing to let this place live in gridlock. And then from their ivory tower, they stand and they lecture us on how our quest for transparency it's impeding the business of this place. There is a pretty easy solution to this, Madam Speaker. You could just hand over the documents as requested by the elected members of this place. If they would have done that by now, we wouldn't be here today. I would not be speaking on this privileged debate today. They could do it today, and recognizing that my time will run short at adjournment and I will come back Monday morning to conclude my speech and take hopefully decent questions from members of the NDP Liberal government, I'm willing to sacrifice. I am willing to sacrifice and cede that time if the government were just to do the right thing. Hand over the documents. It's a Friday afternoon. It's a dump. They can get rid of it. Maybe nobody will notice. But the reason that they're obviously hiding them and refusing to do so is because they are very, very worried about those consequences. Now, I mentioned the legislative agenda of this government, and if you want to call it that, but let's kind of review where are we actually at and perhaps understand why they might not want to move forward with their own agenda. They, of course, the Minister of Justice has the Orwellian Bill C-63, a widely panned piece of legislation that would see Canadians arrested for speech that the Liberals deemed impermissible, speech that they don't like. Now, George Orwell's dystopian future is proving eerily correct under this Liberal government, with thought crime set to be added to our legal books should that bill ever pass. Or we have Bill C-65, the Electoral Participation Act, that is also underway in theory. Or maybe we should call it by what it, more appropriately would be, the Ensuring the Leader of the NDP's Pension Act, since the NDP and Liberals got together and cut some backroom deals to get another payout on the backs of hard-working Canadian taxpayers.
I have a point of order from the Honourable Member for Edmonton-Grisba.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. This point of order is related to a claim of relevance. He's bringing up pensions. His leader has over $1 million pension, 50 times bigger than...
Okay, that is debate. That is debate, and the Honourable Member knows. The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
I think I struck a nerve. They seem a little bit upset by talking about when their leader's pension comes to fruition and legislation that is literally trying to move back the election date to enable a whole bunch of them that were elected in 2019 that are probably not coming back to this place after the carbon tax election. They're trying to get their pension. Once again, the NDP leader last night put his pension above Canadians and our country. Another failure, but it's not surprising. Now, continuing on to what we could be debating on Monday, if the government, the Liberals, just handed over the documents. We could go to Bill C-73, the Nature Accountability Act, which our Environment Committee is attempting to do a pre-study on to circumvent the fact that they won't hand over the documents to try to help themselves in the future pass legislation. So obviously, I, as a proud member of the Environment Committee, have looked at the legislation, and I'll summarize it as this. It's a plan to make a plan, which is consistent with this government. It is all about trying to build bureaucracy, help their friends out, but not actually accomplish anything. It's lazy environmentalism that is best summarized as all of this Liberal government's environmental policy. So I asked the minister who was before us on this bill this week, the radical environment minister, about what additional spending and or potential new hiring of bureaucracy would be needed to enact this legislation should we pass it. And he refused to say. He just would not admit that there might be. And I asked about, well, could you look for internal savings, given the fact that 53%, there's been a 53% increase in the number of senior executives within that department. Maybe we could look a little internally and try to find some efficiencies, we'll call it, within that department. Or do we just need to go back to the piggy bank of Canadians and borrow more, increase our debt, increase inflation, just to pay for their reckless, bureaucratically bloating ideas? Now, Madam Speaker, I've been here a little over a year now, but I think I've come to understand the Liberals' guiding principles in this place. And I would say principle one is, when something doesn't work, just throw money at it. That must be the solution. It looks like we're doing something if we just throw more money at it. Or principle number two is, when people don't work, hire more of them. Clearly, that has been the track record. And principle number three is that when things actually are working well, bring in some Liberal insiders and break it. And that's how we've ended up doubling the number of bureaucrats over the last 9 years. Even the parliamentary budget officer is questioning whether or not Canadians are seeing an increase in service delivery after all of that new spending. I've talked to constituents. Anybody that deals with this behemoth of a federal government rightfully has complaints about any sort of service standards. You know, passports are not being returned to people faster. Your PAL, your firearm licensing application, which there is many people currently undertaking the courses to become trained and tested responsible firearms owners, it's slowing down. It's not getting any faster. Nobody has said to me, oh, I called CRA the other day. They answered like that. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed that. It's the exact opposite, Madam Speaker. Nothing is working better under this federal government right now. Despite more debt-fueled spending to once again expand that bloated bureaucracy without outcomes. Because that's what we should measure, not how much we throw in terms of money at the problem. Are we improving the outcomes and delivery of what the federal government should be focused on for Canadians? Of course, we have the recent NDP Liberal tax trick is another example of the failed philosophy. Because the reality is, we in this country, industry in this country, unfortunately has faced regulatory strangulation, for lack of a better term, and perhaps it is the right term. We'll use one example of many, many terrible pieces of legislation that have continuously focused on driving out investment, driving away opportunities, and just trying to add problematic elements for those entrepreneurs and investors, whether they be individuals or Canadian public pension plans, that want to invest in Canada, that want to build in Canada. Of course, we have Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, or maybe more appropriately named the Never Build Anything Ever Again in This Country bill, as a prime example of why we've made it so unattractive to invest in and do business in this country. This is evident by the fact of the massive outflow of foreign direct investment that has previously been in Canada that is now going to the States. And I'd be surprised if anybody in this House hasn't talked to a business owner in their community that has said, well, in the case to me anyways, if you guys don't win, I'm leaving. It is a real problem, and the data bears out that it is happening already, and it's because of that strangulation through regulation and legislation under this Liberal government. They treat the economy like it's some sort of machine. You're just going to pull some levers and press some buttons and everything's going to work out just fine. And they're not even trying to hide their plans. They regularly say we need to build the future economy and transition our economy. What they mean when they say that is that they want a government-controlled, centrally planned and manipulated economy. Entrepreneurs be damned. The Liberals know what Canadians need, what they want, and they're going to try their best to make sure that the economy matches their ideology. That is not the way the economy works, Madam Speaker. Instead of trying to drive economic growth through private sector investment, they choose to spend and spend and spend, which is why we've seen a doubling of our national debt. We've seen drastic increases in the price of life, whether it be through direct taxation on individuals, on companies, or of course the hated carbon tax, it's not surprising when you focus on changing the economy to something you believe it should be, taxing everybody to death, that we have a doubling of the price of all homes in this country, a doubling of the rent, record-breaking numbers of people lining up at food banks in our, what should be a prosperous leader of a nation. And now they've doubled down of late. They're trying to bribe Canadians with their own money, with their $250 check proposal, and a temporary, a pause. It's been called in this chamber a lot over the last number of days, a tax cut. A tax cut to me means it's actually cut, not that you hit the pause button and said, we'll give you 2 months of a break on a couple of items that we deem to be essential. That's what they decide what is going to be listed in terms of this temporary pause, this temporary, it's a tax trick. That's right, it's a tax trick. Even my opposition colleagues know that this is simply a temporary tax trick. Now, I suppose maybe the Liberals think, well, my hand's in your pocket already, you might as well just grab a little bit of extra cash out there. But what they have failed to realize, and has been brought up by members of the opposition, is the havoc that is that's going to reap on small business owners. Again, I've received calls, I assume all members from wherever they may be, have received calls saying, do you know how a point-of-sale system works? Do you know how hard it is to get an overnight December 13th group of staff to come in and make all of these changes? And then what if we collectively screw something up a little bit? CRA is just going to come and audit me right away? They like the idea of actual tax reductions, of permanent tax reductions. That will help drive prosperity, but this tax trick is simply not appealing and is driving a whole bunch of extra work. We've all heard the same thing. People are going to come and return things now and rebuy them at the busiest time of the year. There are legitimate grievances from our small business community, the backbone of our economy, that were just, of course, under this Liberal government, once again, I don't even call them ignored. They were probably just never listened to. Consulting is not something that this Liberal government takes a lot of pride in. They say something and they announce something, everybody's upset at them, and then they just decide, well, forge ahead. It doesn't matter if it's a terrible idea or not. And I think that some of these examples illustrate what we've seen here in terms of the matter at hand of the Liberal Green slush fund scandal. And I've in my previous interventions in this place detailed the history of this scandal, but I'll provide a little bit of context for Canadians that are listening in, perhaps for the first time, and wondering why are they still debating this privilege motion? Why won't the government just hand over the documents? Reasonable questions for Canadians to ask.
Do that kind of noise, it can be very bothersome for the interpreters. The tapping on the desk. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And just once again, to summarize, the Sustainable Development Technology Canada organization, it's a body that started back in 2001 to fund companies creating technologies that promote sustainable development. It's not a bad idea. Investing in technology, not taxes. Where have I heard that before? I think it's been coming from this side of the House, because it is a good idea. But the Liberals applied some of those principles that I earlier outlined. When something works well, bring in some Liberal insiders and break it. And so that's exactly what they did. They hired Annette Verschuren in 2019 to chair this board of directors that oversees payments from the fund. Now, she as an individual and an organization had received SDTC funding in the past. So obviously a couple of red flags went up across the bureaucracy, and I applaud them for that. Now, despite being warned, this Liberal government went ahead. They just said, okay, whatever, we'll just appoint her anyways. And under her watch, an environment just rotten with conflicts of interest thrived. This Liberal-friendly board awarded funding to organizations that they individually had a financial interest in. The gravy train, unfortunately, couldn't go on forever for those board members. And thanks to all
the honourable member will have 6 minutes to conclude his remarks when we next return to the subject. Having reached the expiry of the time provided for today's debate, the House will resume consideration on the privilege motion at 11 a.m. on Monday, December 2nd, 2024.
The honourable member from Portage Lisgar has 6 minutes left in the debate. The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a pleasure to return. Obviously, the government has not taken me up on my offer of Friday that I would give up the last 6 minutes of my speech if they just decided to do a Friday document dump with this information being handed over. And where I left off during the speech on Friday was talking about the gravy train. The gravy train that had to come to an end at some point for SDTC when whistleblowers in 2022 and more so in 2023 came forward with very concerning allegations. And therefore, after the Auditor General rightfully announced that there would be an audit of SDTC, which was released in June 2024. And only a sample of those contracts were actually investigated by the AG, yet they found $390 million of funds that were inappropriately awarded. And even worse, 186 conflicts of interest. Not one, not two, not that that would be acceptable, but 186. As I say, this was only a quarter of all of the projects, and we can all assume that the damage is actually much, much worse for taxpayers. Now, in light of this damning evidence provided by the AG, this House of Commons of duly elected members passed a motion directing the government to hand over those documents. It was stipulated that they could also be handed to the RCMP, who could investigate whether or not there were criminal offences committed by the government. What have they done? They did their best. Their best work is delaying and distracting, forcing the Speaker to rule that the government had violated the privilege of this House and all of its members. And as representatives of Canadians, wherever we may come from and whatever party we may be a part of, it is our duty to defend and uphold our democratic institutions, especially in light of the overwhelming disrespect being shown by this Liberal government for not just taxpayers, but for all Canadians that we represent here. And it's surprising to me that I see a continued silence from the government side, those that are more or less willingly aiding and abetting the government in this, because it's objectively wrong, and we all know that, and to not stand up against it is simply wrong. This is not a technical disagreement or a procedural matter. It is a direct and deliberate defiance of the authority of Parliament and the fundamental bedrock of our democracy. And in turn, the government itself has sabotaged the work of Parliament, preventing anything from moving forward. The question, of course, has to be, well, what are the Liberals hiding? Why are they so concerned to hand over these documents? What are the consequences that they fear so much? Because their refusal to release these, I think, speaks volumes. And Canadians are sick and tired of it. And I'd like to narrow in on one specific piece of this plotline, and it's the actions of our radical environment minister, whose behaviour epitomizes what's wrong with this Liberal government. Now, you see, Mr. Speaker, before he came to Ottawa to enact his lazy and failed environmental policies, he was a strategic advisor at Cycle Capital, an environmental venture firm owned and operated by an individual who was miraculously on the SDTC board, where millions of dollars were given to this firm. And the minister owns shares in Cycle Capital, a business that's profited handsomely during this time. In fact, the valuation skyrocketed roughly 600% since he entered cabinet. And of course, another $17 million was handed over during his tenure. This isn't a lapse in judgment, Mr. Speaker. This is a blatant conflict of interest, and it's really a slap in the face to Canadians who expect their tax dollars to be spent wisely, not used to make yourself and your friends rich. The minister has ignored the law. He's made a mockery of his position and the public trust that he holds. So to summarize in my last 2 minutes here, Mr. Speaker, Auditor General looked at 5 years of transactions, 226 deals that were approved, and found 186 conflicts of interest, or in different terms, 82% of all the transactions had a conflict of interest. Again, not 1%, not 2%, not that that would be acceptable, but this is so far beyond acceptable. The fact that we have seen a government refuse to hand this over, and members of the government side not stand up and say, yeah, ooh, this is something we should probably take a serious look at. Maybe the RCMP should too. And that's why it's so vital that these documents be handed over. At the time, the conflicts of interest, they were deemed, quote, manageable by the chair of the board, the Liberal-appointed chair that has seen this rot and corruption run rampant throughout her time in leading this board. What's worse, Mr. Speaker, is when you think about the volume of $400 million, it's very difficult to understand what that made-up amount of money seems like. So think of the taxes you pay in terms of your income tax. Think of your neighbors down the street, all of those in your community. It's well over 20,000 people at the average salary paying all of their taxes just for the government to go and waste it to make themselves richer. At the end of the day, I believe it is vital that the government just be honest. Just show a little bit of humility for the first time in these long, miserable last 9 years of their tenure. And I hope that perhaps some of my Liberal colleagues, after hearing myself and many of our colleagues discuss this egregious process that's been taken, they stand up and they say it's time to cut the cover up, just to hand over the documents, face whatever consequences may be entailed. Because, Mr. Speaker, this simply cannot stand. Canadians are watching. They know and are waiting patiently for a carbon tax election. Let's have that election.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Leader of, Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the member said defend and uphold democratic institutions. Today there's breaking news coming from CBC in regards to the Conservative leadership. And I'd like to quote from the story. Campaign workers were told by representatives of the Government of India to stop supporting Brown, not to sell membership cards for him, and not to invite him to certain events. Mr. Speaker, there is strong connections between the corruption within the Conservative Party and its leadership and the current leader. This is a very serious issue, and yet we have the leader of the Conservative Party today refusing to get the security clearance. The only leader in the House of Commons that refuses to do it. I've been accusing him for weeks now of hiding something. I believe that this is one of the issues that he is hiding behind, Mr. Speaker. My question to the member, when he says defend and uphold our democratic institutions, does he not believe that the leader of the official opposition has a responsibility to Canadians to stop hiding, come clean, and get the security clearance?
The Honourable Member from Portage-Lisker.
I said it earlier that this government's best attribute is to distract and deflect. And what a great first way to show that in a question that is about the $400 million of corrupt lining of pockets of themselves and their insiders. And to try to spin this like it's anything else is just simply absurd. I'm not going to take any lessons from that member who's been part of a corrupt 9-year-long government that has failed Canadians, that has driven up the cost of housing, of rent, of everything else in life, meanwhile making themselves and their little insiders rich.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member from Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Portage-Lisker for his speech. I know it is shocking to me how much of a scandal this is and how much money we're talking about. And I thought it was really collegial of him to have offered the government to give up his time if they simply just release the documents. I know when I talk to people in Fort McMurray Cold Lake, they are astounded by the fact that the government is so afraid of what these documents contain that they refuse to release them. Is that something that he hears in Portage-Lisker?
The Honourable Member from Portage-Lisker.
Thank you to my colleague for the question. Absolutely. You know, it is a topic of conversation when folks turn on the CPAC channel and say, are they still debating this? And the logical person, which are the folks, the common sense folks that I represent, say, why wouldn't the government just hand over these documents? Obviously, has to be something to hide. So most definitely that's what they ask me. What do you think's in the documents? That's the question I get. And I say, well, I don't know, because this government has a great track record of whenever they do hand over any documents, they're so heavily blacked out and redacted we can barely read them anyway, something we're seeing under our Environment Committee on the second new Green Slush Fund that I suspect we might be having a similar debate in the not-too-distant future. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the other question I get often asked is, when is the election? When can we have the carbon tax election? I hope to answer that very soon.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member from St. John's Rothsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning to all of my colleagues. And Mr. Speaker, I came up yesterday with great anticipation that we were going to get some work for Canadians done in the House this week. But obviously, I'm very, very disappointed. I'm here to work on behalf of my constituents of St. John Rothsay. I'm here to continue to advocate for stuff like our wonderful housing programs, our child care benefits, so on and so forth. But we can't get that work done for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the member opposite, first question is he ready to get to work on behalf of Canadians? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we know that the Leader of the Opposition will not get a security clearance. Can the member talk to his leader and please encourage him to get that security clearance? More and more Canadians, week in and week out, are wondering what's up over there with the Leader of the Opposition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Well, I'll start by saying I will happily talk to my member, as will all my colleagues, because we actually like our leader. Something on this side of the House we're awfully proud of. But only a Liberal would stand here and say, I want to get to work, just not talking about the $400 million of corruption that we're caught up in. This is work, my colleague over there. This is work. Holding a government to account for what the Auditor General has found to be an egregious 186 various conflicts of interest lining the pockets of themselves and their insiders. Canadians ask me, where is the money? Where has it gone? We've borrowed, we spent, and now we see more and more Liberal corruption. So if you don't call this work, I don't know what you call it.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Medicine Hat, Cardston, Warner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech, or the end of his speech today. And one thing that really grabbed my attention was 82% of his comment that 82% of what the Auditor General the files that she went through were found to have some issues, that there was some corruption potential there. Now, the part that I am also concerned about is these are just the documents and the review that the Auditor General did. I'd like to ask my colleague whether he suspects, as I do, that if the Auditor General was to do a review of all the contracts of SCTC, that the $400 million may pale at what we might find that's the actual real corruption going on in that particular fund.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great point. Like any other sampling, you're doing polling, you're doing anything like that, you're picking a sample, and that's what the Auditor General obviously did. And this is the level of corruption that was found during that investigation. It's only reasonable to assume that the percentage continues. And worse, that dollar value of nearly $400 million of misspent funds is going to continue on that same trajectory too. We yet don't know the total cost to taxpayers of this Liberal corruption, which is obviously of deep concern. I think that's why it's so vital that despite the deflection and distraction attempts by Liberals across the way there, that we get to the bottom of this. And more important, let the RCMP have the opportunity to view these documents to find out if, in fact, there was anything criminal on that $390 million that we know of, and probably a heck of a lot more.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important question when we have the Leader of the official opposition continuing to hide his past because he's scared to get the security clearance. And now, fast forward to today, where he's playing a multi-million-dollar game at great cost to Canadians because he wants to give documents that the RCMP have said that they don't want to receive from the Leader of the Conservative Party in the form of an instruction, but rather the issue should be brought over to the Procedures and House Affairs Committee. The Leader of the Conservative Party is a destructive force to democracy in Canada today. On those two policies alone, will the member indicate that he'll talk to his leader, explain to his leader what he is doing is politically good for his self-interest, but it's not in the best interest of Canadians, that the Leader of the Opposition needs to get that security clearance and he needs to stop this multi-million-dollar game?
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
It is obvious that debating and getting to the bottom of $400 million of Liberal corruption is not in the best interest of the Liberal Party. It is in the best interest of Canadians. And while he might find it astounding that Parliament has a role to play in checks and balances on this corrupt Liberal government, I don't. And I was not sent here by my constituents to be just a guy that says, okay, it's fine, it's only $400 million. The Liberals have spent so much more than that, it's really just a drop in the bucket. Well, he may not care about the taxpayers' money that is brought in by this government and the additional amounts borrowed to pay for their tax and spend policies that are driving up the cost of everything. My constituents do that, and I will proudly, every day, not consider this a waste of time and money, but a proud role that opposition members must and will continue to play until that government hands over the documents.
L'honorable député de Rivière-des-Mille-Îles.
The honourable member for, oh, I'm so sorry, Longueuil-Saint-Hubert.
C'est un peu scandaleux, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, it's ridiculous. We're hearing about Liberal corruption and spending, but this Parliament has been paralyzed for 6 weeks. This has cost millions of dollars in taxpayer money. Canada and Quebec taxpayers, what the Conservatives have been doing for a month and a half. We're not discussing things that are important for Canadians. We're not talking about inflation or climate change. We're not talking about the housing crisis. We're not talking about the language crisis. But instead, we've been wasting our time for a month and a half because of the Conservatives, and they should be ashamed.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisker.
Well, first of all, Parliament functions whether or not we're debating this or anything else, as it should, and this is an important function of Parliament. That's why members of this House voted with the majority, supported by the Speaker, to continue this investigation. And I happily will, Mr. Speaker, because this is important. Anybody that thinks $400 million is you can just sweep it under the rug, well, they probably shouldn't be in this place spending any money at all.